Ready to go. Good morning. Welcome on behalf of the Knight Commission on Intercollegiate Athletics to Remaking the NCAA Beyond Constitutional Reforms. I'm Sandy Hatfield Clubb. I have the pleasure of serving as a consultant to the Knight Commission, and I'll be your moderator today. In the interest of time, I'm going to introduce our first speaker, and then the rest of our panelists and speakers will be introduced along the way. With that, I'm going to turn it over to Peter Roby, who serves as the interim athletic director at Dartmouth University and a member of the Knight Commission. Peter.
Thank you, Sandy. Good morning, everybody. Thank you for being here. Edgar Schein, the great organizational management guru from MIT, talks about how leaders embed culture. And specifically, he talks about cultures created and sustained by a number of things that leaders do, one of which is what they pay attention to, how they distribute and manage their resources, where those resources go. And thirdly, is how they respond in a crisis. And all of that, especially issues around crisis, are about how you restore confidence in the organization. And we're at a time in our history of collegiate athletics where we need to restore the confidence of the enterprise. And the way we do that, I think, is to stay focused on our values and make that all of our decisions are filtered through our values. And our values, the stated values, are about what's in the best interest of our students, their health and safety, and their education. And the things that you'll hear today from my colleagues on the Knight Commission and the things that the Knight Commission has been about for so many years has been about making education the primary driver of the work that we do, and to help develop young people and keep them safe. And so from its inception, the Knight Commission's work has been driven by our values. Our purpose is to lead transformational change, to prioritize the education, health, safety, and success of college athletes. The commission was founded by university presidents as an independent think tank for college sports to offer a roadmap of reform. The Knight Commission believes in the importance and life-changing role athletics plays in the experience of college athletes, and more broadly, the role athletics plays in our universities and communities. Like myself, 2/3 of our commission members were college athletes. You'll notice that our members include thought leaders with a range of experiences, including leaders in professional sports, like Jonathan Mariner, who you will hear from in a little bit. Our co-chairs include former U.S. Secretary of Education Arne Duncan, former NBA and college basketball star and attorney Len Elmore, and Nancy Zimpher, the former chancellor of the State University of New York. I also want to welcome and acknowledge the commissioner of the WCC and one of our Knight Commission members and colleagues, Gloria Navarez, who's here with us this morning as well. Welcome, Gloria. Thank you. Now I'd like to turn it over to my colleague, Dr. Christine Copper, who is the faculty athletics rep at the U.S. Naval Academy.
Thanks, Peter, and good morning, everyone. Thanks for coming to my house here. As an independent organization, the Knight Commission hires experts from legal to financial to inform our diverse membership of thought leaders as we make recommendations. An example of past effort that influenced major transformational change was our proposal that an academic threshold be required for postseason eligibility. Specifically, that teams be on track to graduate at least half of their players to be eligible for postseason championships. It's worth noting this proposal was initially resisted by leaders, and it took a decade to implement. Similarly, our proposal to include academic incentives in the NCAA distribution took years to take hold. In December of 2019, we began a far-reaching examination of Division I to respond to the challenges that athletics leaders are facing. Today's convention to vote on a new constitution and the next phase of work for Division I validates the commission's decision nearly 2 years ago to examine ways to transform Division I sports. Our examination included a number of independent studies by experts that were conducted to inform each of our reports and recommendations. While we don't have time to summarize those studies today, they are accessible on the Knight Commission website. And I want to emphasize here, right, our goal is not to dismantle the educational model of college sport. Instead, we believe our goal is shared by all of you, right? To develop solutions to respond to the current challenges so the educational model of college sport can actually be strengthened. Over the past 2 years, we've produced a series of 5 reports framed under the title of Transforming the D1 Model to overhaul the NCAA Division I structure and its governance, as well as improve its financial framework. Today's session will primarily focus on our recommendations around the financial framework and the importance of independent oversight and appropriate representation in governance within college sports. I want to briefly mention that in April of 2020, we advanced principles for NIL rules. There are 2 overarching issues among our principles that continue to be of concern. First, the only restrictions in the NCAA policy that also exist in various state laws are that institutions cannot arrange NIL deals and the compensation can't be pay for play or serve as recruiting inducements. Without clearly defined guardrails, like what our group advanced, we are already seeing a number of publicly reported NIL deals that challenge these restrictions. Second, we agree with leaders who believe there should be uniformity in approach to NIL instead of the patchwork of state laws that we currently have. Now I'd like to introduce Jonathan Mariner, who's one of my Knight Commission colleagues. Jonathan's the former Executive Vice President and Chief Financial Officer of Major League Baseball. Jonathan chaired our committee that designed the C.A.R.E model, which will be the focus of the rest of the session.
Thank you, Sandy. The majority of our discussion today will be about current challenges and potential solutions to changing the financial
We
framework.
can't hear Jonathan.
Can you hear me now? Is that? Hang on.
We can hear you online.
Jonathan, I
John.
think it's on our end, so just.
Okay.
They're working to make sure they have your audio on here.
All right.
You might have to be Jonathan.
While we're having this technical break, help yourself to coffee. Bagels in the back.
Guess you should have done a sound check, huh?
Jonathan, we're ready for you.
Okay, can you hear me now in the room?
Oh, they need to turn him up.
How's
Don't
that?
you
Test,
Say a
1, 2,
test
3.
again. Hold up. Say a test again because we can't.
Test, 1, 2,
There-
3.
there we go.
Test. You got it?
Yes.
All right, thank you. And thank you, Sandy. The majority of our discussion today will be about current challenges and potential solutions to changing the financial model. Before we outline what we believe is at least a starting point for solutions to address the serious financial issues that leaders have identified in commission-led as well as Lead One surveys, I want to share a few comments from my experience with Major League Baseball. And like so many of my colleagues on the Knight Commission and many of you participating today, I was not a college athlete. I only dreamed of being one. But I was and remain a huge fan of college sports, and I'm a strong believer in the value of a college education. Several people may question the relationship between college athletics and my 25 years spent in professional sports. To that end, I'd like to share several observations that I think can help make that connection and put our Knight Commission recommendations into better perspective. There are several aspects of the challenges currently facing intercollegiate athletics that mirror the challenges every professional sports league has faced at some point and sought to address. First, there's the issue of uneven revenue distribution across the league, which then fuels unfettered spending, which then drives up the cost of competing. The profligate spending of any one team drives up the cost to compete for all other competitors. And we think that holds true today in college sports. There's a second interesting observation I'd like to share. In 2011, something very unusual happened in professional sports. All four of the major professional sports leagues, MLB, the NFL, the NBA, and NHL, they all had their collective bargaining agreements expiring that same year. The NHL Players Association had the option of rolling over their agreement until 2012, and they did so. Still, when all the dust settled, 3 of the 4 major professional sports leagues had work stoppages before successfully reaching a labor agreement. And the reason was the same for all 3 leagues: to reform their business model. All 3 felt that their existing business model did not allow their teams, and not just the big market teams, to at least break even. Their business models were broken, and they took major steps to fix them. As a footnote, MLB ironically was the only league that year that did not sustain a work stoppage when their CBA ended. However, the player strike in 1994 was the beginning of when MLB reformed their business model, which was solidified in their 2002 CBA. At the end of the day, all 4 leagues chose to shut down their sport to make sure they had a financially feasible, sustainable business model. And for those of you who are soccer fans, I did not mention MLS, mainly because Darren Garber came from the NFL and they built their model around the learnings and lessons from the other 4 sports leagues. I'd like to make one final observation. Many people think that the profit motive is what distinguishes professional sports from intercollegiate athletics. The reality is that most sports team owners are not in it for a profit. Most of them have already accumulated their wealth and didn't acquire a sports team to make more money. Instead, their goal is simply to not have to write more checks to subsidize their team's operations. That is very similar to collegiate sports, where every college president and athletic director dreams of having a self-sustaining athletics program versus having to subsidize it with student fees and other university resources. The reforms being proposed by the Knight Commission is our attempt to push collegiate athletics to change their business model to that same end and to be more responsive to and reflective of its mission to serve and support the student athlete and the educational model. We believe that a commitment to change the financial structure by NCAA, CFP, and D1 conferences is essential to rebuild trust and ultimately to secure a federal legislative solution. Our proposal, connecting athletics revenues with the educational model of college sports, which we have dubbed the C.A.R.E model, given the fitting acronym, we think it responds directly to the expressed desires of athletics administrators to have a model that provides greater financial management and supports the educational model more fully. It also addresses the concerns lawmakers have, and quite frankly, the public shares, that we have a broken financial model. Requirements we propose can be imposed either by Congress or by the respective college sports governing bodies and/or conferences without any changes to current governance structure. To review our C.A.R.E model, I'd like to introduce our Knight Commission's CEO, Amy Perko. Amy, I'll turn it over to you.
Thanks, Jonathan. I'm going to present several of slides here, a handful of slides that get into the details of our C.A.R.E model. And then we'll move to a panel discussion with a couple of experts from different viewpoints. And then we'll have questions from all of you. So getting to the details, it's important to note that the C.A.R.E model proposal only impacts shared athletic revenue distributions, as shown on the slide, as everyone knows, from the NCAA through March Madness, from the CFP through its FBS football championship revenues, and from Division I conferences through their media contracts, networks, and championships. It does not include the revenues each school may generate independently through their own ticket sales or other kinds of activities. Together, these entities distribute more than $3.5 billion annually. Our proposal recommends changes to both the distribution criteria as well as how institutions spend these revenues. So as you listen to this presentation and consider support of the CARE model, principles and concept, pleased to share with you in advance the following reactions. Our proposal has received a big endorsement from 21 coaches associations representing more than 30 men's and women's sports in which more than 240,000 athletes compete, including more than 84,000 Division I athletes. And we're pleased that Kathy DeBoer, the Executive Director of the American Volleyball Coaches Association, is a leader among these coach associations, and she's with us today and will participate in the panel discussion. Also, in talking with FBS leaders, their reaction has been that something like our CARE model is needed to address what many believe has become an indefensible financial model in the FBS in particular. So our CARE model will require that shared revenues be tethered directly to the educational purpose with a special emphasis on the core principles of transparency, independent oversight, gender equity, broad-based opportunities, and finally, the financial responsibility for athlete health, education, health, and safety. So each of these principles is absent in whole or in part from the current system. And I'll make a note here that as this slide notes there at the bottom, the current system does include academic incentives, as Christine also noted. And I would note that that was a recommendation the commission proposed in advance, and it took more than 10 years to be embedded now in the NCAA revenue distribution system. But also to note that because it is now part of the system, over the lifetime of the current contract, it will mean more than $1 billion in incentives will be rewarded to institutions for achieving those academic outcomes. So moving forward, I'll briefly review the principles that we're advancing and the impact of implementation. So first, our proposal recommends two overarching principles. The first is transparency, and transparency would require two components: one, disclosure of the revenue distribution plans, and then second, disclosure of gender and ethnicity demographic of college athletes and athletic staff by the institutions receiving the distributions. Now, as all of you know, these data are currently reported by institutions and collected, but not publicly disclosed in the institutional performance program. The second principle is independent oversight. Independent oversight is required to approve these plans and the compliance with these principles. Emphasizing the importance of independent oversight is not a new concept to the Knight Commission. We first recommended in 2013 that the NCAA's governing board include independent directors and including experts on priority issues like health and safety. Independent directors, as you know, were added to the Board of Governors in 2018 and have made major contributions, and there will be independent directors will continue on this newly constructed board moving forward. We continue to believe that independent oversight is not only crucial to the CARE model implementation, but also to the future divisional governance. So we've also advanced that the division governance that will be created, should include independent directors with particular expertise, particularly health and safety. So on that point, we appreciate Dr. Asplund with the U.S. Council on Athletes' Health for being on our panel today. You'll hear from him a little bit later. So to provide an example of the impact of the gender equity principle on the distribution criteria, let's look specifically at the NCAA's revenue distribution formula. And you all have seen this graph before. I want to just point out the most important slice of the pie here is in red, and that is the 28% of the current NCAA distribution that rewards athletic success only for men's basketball in the current formula. So applying our gender equity principle would require that the NCAA's distribution policy change to address its current discrimination, and that any financial incentives a national governing entity rewards for athletic success must also reward for the performance of men's and women's team on an equal basis. This recommendation to address the gender equity discrimination in the current formula is consistent with the conclusion reached in the Kaplan-Heckler report commissioned by the NCAA Board of Governors. In a recent discussion we had with an individual conference about applying our principles, this was a specific issue that in fact led to a change in their conference policy and how they handled their own conference policy on bonuses and distribution to member schools. So we bring that up as an example of how, just applying this principle could change not only the national distribution, but what happens at the conference level as well. Similarly, let's look at how applying our broad-based sport opportunity principle would impact the CFP distribution by requiring that any incentives provided for athletic success must be matched by incentives to schools for offering more than the minimum number of sports required for its classification. So in this example, the $48 million provided by the CFP in football performance bonuses must be matched by an incentive pool of $48 million to reward broad-based sports opportunities. A key goal with this principle is to incentivize schools clearly for sustaining and growing sports offerings and opportunities. Our principle of financial responsibility recommends a conference-based approach to provide greater accountability for the spending of shared athletic revenues toward education-centric priorities. A conference-based approach is recommended here for two reasons. One, the similar characteristics of conference schools enables achieving consensus on challenging financial issues. And second, conference level action is more likely to withstand antitrust scrutiny. Our report provides 3 examples of conference-based approaches. These are bold, creative, and innovative examples conferences can consider to ensure that appropriate amounts of distributed revenues are being spent on this core educational purpose of college sports, rather than investing disproportionate amounts on seeking just competitive advantages. And these are concepts, as Jonathan noted, that have been implemented and are implemented at the professional sports level and by other organizations. Conferences could use one or more of these examples or design their own, and I'll briefly describe each of the examples. So example 1 requires that schools spend an amount equal to at least 50% of its shared athletic revenue distributions on athlete education, medical expenses, or send money to the university academics. So our commission preliminarily modeled how 229 Division I public institutions would perform against this criteria, and that information is available on our website. I will give you just one brief takeaway. The majority of Division I schools actually meet this criteria. As you might expect, it's among the Power 5 schools that have much larger distributions where there's a difference. There are some Power 5 schools that also meet this criteria. Example 2 requires limits on regulated operating expenses that could have a targeted threshold. This could legally include coaches' salaries in that overall expenditure line. So limits would reflect competitive division affiliation and could utilize competitive and financial penalties for exceeding those targets or incentives for staying within the targets or the limits. So example 3 would allow conferences to address excessive coaching salaries, again, within the conference through a luxury tax system. Conferences could assess financial penalties or withhold distributions for total coaching salaries that exceed a certain limit, or index coaching salaries to instructional salaries that again triggers penalties or withholds distributions. So examples 4 and 5 in our report provide ways Congress could regulate financial responsibility if the current college sports governance fails to act. Example 4 is a way Congress could act to handle excessive coaching compensation by changing the application of the not-for-profit taxation rules. And example 5 suggests Congress could mandate any of our examples 1 through 3. So I'll note here that, we've seen some of the other solutions that have been proposed by lawmakers, and we think that our proposed solution is a much more appropriate way to address the issues without having, the significant unintended consequences that would happen out of some of the proposals we've seen that have been made thus far. So I will turn, in terms of just some closing comments on the C.A.R.E model before we turn it over to the panel discussion. Again, we believe Division I, as it takes the next step forward in this phase of rebuilding, remaking Division I, that it should make our care model the centerpiece of its new Division I commitments and framework. We've heard experts suggest that Division I must contemplate 2 future scenarios. Number one, either seek congressional legislative protection for the current educational model, or 2, be prepared for a new model that includes collective bargaining and athlete employees who are also students. So again, we believe that the help Division I is looking for from lawmakers will not happen without a commitment to change the financial framework. This commitment must also include changes to the CFP revenue distribution, a system that is managed independent of the NCAA. And on this point, we recommend you read the recently published op-ed by our members that make a strong case for CFP reform. And I think that information was included in your material, and so we would recommend that you read that. With that, I'll turn it over to Sandy.
Thank you, Amy, and thank you, commission members, for that great presentation. To ensure we have plenty of time to take questions from both our in-person and virtual audience, I'm going to introduce our 4 panelists and then dive into questions. So we're pleased to have virtually joining us Knight Commission member and President Emeritus of the University of Hartford, Dr. Walt Harrison. He's going to kick off our panel discussion. He is well known for his leadership within the NCAA, having served on the NCAA Division I Board of Directors and chaired the NCAA Committee on Academics. Secondly, we'll visit with Executive Director of American Volleyball Coaches Association, Kathy DeBoer. Kathy co-chairs the Intercollegiate Coaches Association Coalition, through which 21 coaches associations representing over 30 collegiate sports have publicly endorsed the Knight Commission's CARE model. I'm also pleased to introduce the Director of the U.S. Council for Athletes Health, Dr. Chad Asplund. Dr. Asplund is a nationally recognized expert in athletics healthcare and has most recently served as the past president of the American Medical Society of Sports Medicine. The U.S. Council for Athletes Health recently endorsed the Knight Commission's recommendation to the NCAA Constitution Committee to require at least 1 independent director on each of the division's governing boards as a designated expert or advocate on college athlete physical and/or mental health. Also joining us virtually is Knight Commission legal consultant Gabe Feldman. Gabe is a professor of law and sports law at Tulane University, where he serves as the director of their sports law program and is the university's associate provost for NCAA compliance. Gabe also served as the drafter for the Uniform Law Commission's Name, Image, and Likeness Act. So, President Harrison, we'll start with you. You chaired the NCAA's Committee on Academics for more than a decade during significant reforms that created the current system with APRs and GSRs, financial incentives for exceeding targeted goals and penalties for not meeting APR and GSR thresholds. What key takeaways from your leadership experience would you like to share with the leaders who are now embarking on a comprehensive reform of a path forward for Division I?
Thank you, Sandy. First, do a little sound check. Can you hear me?
Yes, we hear you all. Thank you.
Great. I want to make sure I don't have the same fate as Jonathan. Thanks for inviting me to join. I do believe that this moment in time is very similar to the 2002 and 2003 years in the NCAA. We knew, those of us who were on the Division I board, that we needed to do an extensive redesign of the academic model in Division I college sports. We knew that not enough students were graduating. We knew that students were being assigned to majors and were only really majoring and staying eligible. And so we set out to define some principles that would make a new academic model, what's now called the APP, which includes the APR and the GSR. But we didn't know any of those things existed at the time. We came up with principles. So what you've heard today from my colleagues is a set of principles that we will now hand over to the NCAA membership. It's our recommendation for how to define the goals, but we don't actually tell you exactly how all of this will work. And that's the same situation we found. Let me just run quickly through the goals as I see them. One is to make FBS football separate in the business model from the other sports in the NCAA. Second, to link athletics directly to education. I think we've done that in the past, but things like NIL without many guide rails has really made it very difficult to retain this direct connection between the educational mission of our institutions and big-time athletics. Third, to directly address the health, safety, and well-being of student athletes, and to as the NCAA, to recognize that that is our responsibility as well as the responsibility of our member institutions. Fourth, gender equity, very important. And that is part of a general emphasis that all college sports at the Division I level lead to the educational improvement of our athletes. So those are the principles. How do they get implemented? How will this system work? What exactly will the business model be? We are charging you and your colleagues who are now members and representatives of members institutions to define that process and to come up with a solution that will work. I just want to re-emphasize what many of my colleagues have said. Waiting for Congress to make a decision will have unintended consequences that you cannot even begin to imagine. Even well-meaning Congress people do not know college athletes as well as athletics as well as we do. So this is the time, this is the period. Our charge to you is, if you think we've defined the goals, then help us bring those goals to fruition. Thanks.
Thank you, Dr. Harrison. We appreciate you being with us this morning. Kathy, so first off, congratulations on a great year in NCAA Division I women's volleyball and for the overall growth of volleyball at all levels. As executive director of the American Volleyball Coaches Association, you also co-chair the Intercollegiate Coaches Association Coalition. Please share with us what led to the formation of that organization, and then why would 21 coaches associations endorse the Knight Commission's C.A.R.E model?
Thank you, Sandy. The ICAC, the genesis of it really started back in the last restructuring time in 2009, when executive directors of coaches associations found themselves at roundtables in rooms, to use rowing analogies, kind of in a single shell, trying to row up in very troubled waters. And we found each other there and realized that we shared many, many fundamental business challenges as coaches associations, but also shared a lot of principles for governing and what was important. And so the coalition then came together in a very organized way in 2017 to work on some recruiting legislation. That organization allowed us then to spring into action in the spring of 2020 when there was a proposal from the group of 5 commissioners to reduce sports sponsorship, claiming that it was COVID driven to do this, but to do it for 4 years in Division I and to get rid of the parameters that were foundational to broad-based sports programming. So with the help of Grace Calhoun and the Division I Council, broad-based sports programming was deemed as foundational. And so that was another part of the organization. The reason that we again came together to support the C.A.R.E model is, while keeping intercollegiate athletics tied to education is a philosophical template foundation for most of us here, for Olympic sports, decoupling these two is an existential crisis. for two reasons. One is the great increase in access and opportunity for women is based on Title IX. Access and opportunity for women is the right thing to do. It's the fair thing to do. That's not why it got done. It got done because it was mandated through Title IX because intercollegiate athletics was part of education. The second part of it is the commitment of the C.A.R.E model and the Knight Commission to broad-based sports programming. In the last restructuring, we went public with a group coalition about this same size, asking for another tier of sports sponsorship in Division I that would make the A5 programs have to have more programs than 16, a higher level for them to compete. In the time since that restructuring, their revenues have gone up by $50 million, and very, very few sports have been added, making the field even more uneven. And so broad-based sports programming, Title IX, we feel that keeping intercollegiate athletics and higher education tied together is an existential issue to save Olympic sports programming.
Kathy, thank you. Appreciate your comments. And Dr. Asplund, if the proposed NCAA Constitution is approved this afternoon, each division will have an opportunity to design their own individual governance structure. The Knight Commission recommended that at least one independent director on each governing board is designated expert or advocate for college athlete physical and/or mental health. Please share with us why an action like this is important for the future of college sports.
Yeah, thanks for having me, and thanks for the question and the focus on health and safety. I think time and time again, surveys of college athletes, and certainly through this COVID period, physical and mental health is the #1 concern that athletes have. I think the current structure as it stands with the NCAA and their Sports Science Institute, they create best practices or recommendations, but none of these really have any teeth. We're still seeing catastrophic athlete injuries. We're still seeing preventable college athlete deaths because of a lack of enforceability of these requirements. And therefore, I think it's really paramount that as the change to the governance of the NCAA happens, that at least somebody within each division's ability to create legislation, make rules, drive processes have some degree of expertise or advocates for health and safety. It's just the right thing to do. It's what athletes want. It's crazy that we're here in 2022 talking about putting athlete health and safety first. I don't know how we got to college sports for this long, where we're still having to say that out loud, that we need to put athlete health and safety first. That should have been at the very beginning. It was the impetus for the creation of the NCAA at the very beginning, health and safety, but yet we're still in 2022 chasing our tails that we need to put this in. And so I think it's just paramount that somebody in the governance structure making the rule-making processes have some degree of expertise in health and safety. Thank you.
Thank you. And the C.A.R.E model itself has earmarked dollars, athletic shared revenue, directly for student athlete health and safety. Where do you see as the greatest needs in Division I for those resources?
Well, I think when you look at Division I, I've been a team physician at the Power 5 level, the Group of 5 level, D2, D3, HBCU. And so I've seen quite a different distribution of resources and dollars. The simple solution, and I think one that most people would jump to, is that we need these dollars to put more personnel on the process. We need more athletic trainers. We need more doctors. And that's really not where I think the emphasis should be. I think, again, we talk about we're still having preventable catastrophic injuries. We're having preventable deaths that are occurring. What we really need is comprehensive programming, educational programming for athletes, for coaches, for administrators, for medical personnel, to get everybody on the same page with what are the best practices when caring for athletes, coaching athletes, or advising athletes, giving them the ability to understand if an athlete comes to you with this concern, well, that seems like it's a mental health crisis. I need to know that I can recognize that and move it on. Versus, this isn't a correct practice. I think these strength and conditioning coaches are going rogue here. This isn't right. I identified based on my education and the programming that was provided to me that this wasn't correct, and I'm going to move on to change it. And so I think the first thing is really programming, and that can be educational programming to make sure that everybody is up to the same level as far as best practices. It's currently recommended in the NCAA's guidance. The other thing is making sure that emergency action plans and policies and procedures are all up, that everybody has what they need. There needs to be a reimagining of athletic medicine. The current model of athletic department driven hires and keeping it all in-house is currently not working. It's not sustainable. And I think we really need to use those resources for programming as well as a reimagining of the athletic healthcare landscape. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Asplund. And we'll shift over again virtually now to Gabe Feldman. Gabe, there have been questions raised about the legal impact of instituting the C.A.R.E model, particularly given the Supreme Court's recent decision in the Alston case and the antitrust risk of the NCAA agreeing to national rules. So why is the C.A.R.E model a better solution than the status quo?
Thanks, Sandy, and good morning, everybody. I'll say two quick things on this, and my comments will be brief, not because I don't have a lot to say about this, but because I've been asked to keep my comments to 2 or 3 minutes so that we can have time for question and answer. But on the first point to make here is there's discussion in the C.A.R.E model, and then also discussion, obviously, among many within the NCAA and in the room today, that federal intervention may be necessary, and Walt cautioned against part of seeking federal intervention. But to the extent that federal intervention or federal legislation may be the solution, there's some fear that the NCAA cannot reach any national agreements to limit spending or to change spending without federal intervention. And I believe that the NCAA is much less likely to get the federal intervention unless they come up with some national agreement to limit spending along the lines of the C.A.R.E model. Now, putting it into the antitrust context, there is antitrust risk inherent in the structure of college sports, just like Jonathan talked about in the pro sports level, where you have schools or teams that compete on and off the field, but also need to cooperate for the product or for the game to exist. That raises antitrust risk. One way to minimize, if not avoid, that antitrust risk, as suggested by the Supreme Court in the Alston case, is to have the decisions made at the conference level, which is why the C.A.R.E model calls for conference-based decisions on spending, because again, that would be in line with Alston's caution and would likely, because of the lack of market power of any individual conference, withstand antitrust scrutiny, at least under the Alston theory. The other point, I think, is the more central point, and it goes to Kathy's statement that the educational focus of sports is an existential question, and Peter's point that the C.A.R.E model focuses on really the underlying values of college sports and what's in the best interest of our students and making education the primary driver of what they do. That's not only an existential question, that's an antitrust question. And the antitrust question that has been asked over the last century is whether the rules and restrictions the NCAA has in place are reasonably necessary to maintain college sports as distinct from professional sports. And what we've seen through the Alston decision, through the Johnson case, through the General Counsel of the National Labor Relations Board's opinion, that there is a belief that college sports have become less distinct from professional sports, in part because of the massive spending. And Justice Thomas very pointedly asked or commented in the oral argument that it strikes me as odd that coaches' salaries have ballooned and they are in the amateur ranks, as are the players. And there is a sense, both from the written decisions and from the comments made during oral argument, that the courts have become less convinced that college sports as we know it today are distinct from professional sports. So how do we get to a position, how do we get to a place to reaffirm the difference between college sports and pro sports? And I think that answer is to focus or refocus on education. And yes, there will be antitrust risk of controlling spending, but that antitrust risk already exists. And it certainly seems like the status quo is untenable. And whether it's the current litigation facing the NCAA or future antitrust litigation, that this system has lost much of the deference it had received in the past from the Supreme Court. The question is, how do we get that deference back? I believe refocusing on education, making sure this is about the academics first, is a very important step in moving in that direction.
Gabe, thank you for landing the plane on time, my friend. Now to our audience, both in person and virtually, we'd like to get to your questions and your comments. For everybody in person, there are microphones on both sides of the room, so please feel free to use those. Virtually, please use the Q&A function, and we would love to hear your name, your affiliation, and to whom you'd like to direct your question.
Great, thank you. So first off, can we do a test?
Yes, I can hear you, Kaylin. Thank you. Rich, good morning.
Thanks, Sandy. Can you hear me? Two things. First, thank you for organizing this today and your continuing efforts, Amy, to bring an independent view of how we can manage our operations within D1. I have 2 points to make. You talk about independent board members, and I think that's wise that we continue in that direction. But you also miss the point that a third of the membership is not represented on the board currently. And one of the things that the D1 conferences that aren't represented would like to see is that be expanded, that all 32 members sit on the board, and that we do away with the very ineffective Division I presidential forum and its predecessor, the PAG. You know, we've seen enough history to know that we have very little input through that process. And only by expanding the board will you get a full consensus of the D1 membership. Recognizing that the A5 group will continue to have weighted voting in that process, but at least have every presidential council represented on the board so that they can hear and participate in the process. And then secondly, on gender equity, which I've worked on extensively, both as a member of the Women's Basketball Oversight Committee and a board member of the WBCA. I think your thoughts there are really right on. I would ask you that as you look at it beyond revenue, look at restrictions that are preventing revenue growth, particularly as it relates to the broadcast contracts. And I know that the NCAA staff is working hard to build a new model there, but it needs continuing pressure, because we recognize in the Hecker report that was made as part of the study that the broadcast contract, the way it's currently constructed, really has limited that growth, particularly on revenue generation. And we see it as a real source for future growth if it's managed properly. So I would just ask that you add that to your report as well. Thank you.
Thanks, Rich, for those comments. I just want to make two comments that tie to those points on representation and gender equity, just to emphasize another recommendation we made to the NCAA was that in the future governance that there be at least 2 voting athletes on the division boards. We would have liked to have seen at least 2 voting athletes on the Board of Governors. Understand that's only 1. But there is another athlete ex officio. But our other point was that of those 2 athletes, they must represent each gender to make sure that there's gender equitable representation from the athletes. So we would encourage all of you leaders in Division I, as Division I looks at its future governance, that be just a base minimum for the athlete representation and gender equity there.
Thank you, Amy. Thank you, Rich. And we do have a question virtually.
Yeah, so our question is, do you think we will have lost control of D1 athletics due to NIL? We'll pass that to the panelists.
Peter, did you want to address that?
Yeah, I mean, I think we all recognize that there were issues that we hoped we could head off with respect to NIL. We couldn't come to a consensus around that. And then with the Alston case, people got really spooked about any national legislation that would limit those kinds of opportunities. This is, one of those things where, the tail's wagging the dog, and it's been doing that for a while with respect to how we chase revenue, as opposed to how we emphasize the primacy of education. The reason that more and more student athletes feel like they should be compensated is because there's runaway spending and they feel like they're being exploited because their education hasn't been emphasized enough. So every time we hear a story about the kids aren't getting anything, the kids aren't getting anything. So what does that say about how people perceive the value of an education and how it can change the trajectory of a family's life, like mine? So I have no issue with kids being able to be compensated for their name, image, and likeness. I just don't want the focus on education and what's in their best interest to be superseded by that, so that their only interest is to position themselves so they can maximize their NIL. They can chase the NIL, but do it in the context of getting a quality education and having people care for them beyond the contributions that they make on the field. That's a value proposition. And that's, to me, why everything comes back to what are our stated values and do our behaviors match what our espoused values are.
Peter, thank you for your comments. And I'd like to ask Gabe Feldman, who's an expert in the NIL legal space, to see if he'd like to add any comments.
Sure, I would just echo what Peter said and really what I said a minute ago, that I think there is a risk if the NIL rules are not, one, made uniform, and two, made so that they can ensure that spending is consistent with the educational mission. Because the risk is, if NIL continues without any guardrails, without any protection, without ensuring that these are not payments for performance or payments to attend a school or to stay at a school, then that further blurs or maybe eliminates that distinction between college and pro sports. And the more that line is blurred, the less deference that the NCAA is going to get, both in antitrust court and from the judges deciding the labor law cases. And I think it's no surprise that in the labor decisions we've seen, they are citing the Alston decision to say that amateurism does not appear to have been a consistent value of the NCAA, has not been defined consistently. And I think a way to define it and reemphasize it, again, is to put that emphasis on education, and to make sure that the money is being spent on education and that the focus is on students. And I think a way to do that is to make sure that these are legitimate NIL deals. And as Peter said, I am fully in favor of college athletes receiving everything they can make through their name, image, and likeness. But there's a difference between that and college athletes being paid whatever someone is willing to pay them just because they want them to attend a particular school. That second aspect would look a lot more like professional sports, and I think would continue to lead to less deference from the courts.
Thank you, Gabe. We have another question virtually.
This is from Kimberly Klein. Please discuss the priority of education and how that goal aligns with the expanded transfer rules that may potentially reduce graduation rates.
Kaylin, Christine?
Sure, transfer is super easy to talk about. Thanks, guys. Can you repeat the question?
Sure. From Kimberly Klein, please discuss the priority of education and how that goal aligns with the expanded transfer rules that may potentially reduce graduation rates?
So I think a lot of that just goes to educating the students in what the kind of fallout could be when you transfer, right? Having them do the research of when you go to a different institution, what happens to you academically? How many credits don't go with you? How far behind do you get? Is the grass greener, right? I am glad we removed you don't have to sit out for the 5 sports, because there were no data that at this point had supported that made any sense, right? But it's disappointing to see that many students are making transfer decisions that probably are going to harm their academic roadmap, right? And I think there are a lot of good people out there trying to tell the students what they need to know about what transfer can do to you academically, but it's just very difficult when it's such a sport-centric focus for many of them, or perhaps an NIL-centric focus now for many of them, to convince 18 to 22-year-olds that maybe you need to worry about how many credits go with you.
Kathy?
So there was just the change in the transfer rules has been quite recent for 5 sports. Transferring has been allowed in most Olympic sports with immediate eligibility for a long time, and it has not negatively impacted graduation rates. So where the issues are today is the mixing of transfer with NIL. We'll pay you this much if you'll come to our school. That has gummed up the wheels of a transfer process, which most coaches would endorse, is allowing athletes to find a place where they can play, where they can compete, and helping with roster management. So I don't think the two of them are tied directly together. And we have evidence that transferring and immediate eligibility is not the problem. We have that evidence from all the Olympic sports who have had these rules for many, many years.
Amy?
Well, I think we're coming up on the closing, so I wanted to make sure just to take an opportunity here before we close to thank everyone for coming, and we will be sending out, information, follow-up information for everyone who's attended. But also want to just, point out, I know there are a number of the leaders here, conference leaders, and we're glad to present to your conferences on how conferences can take leadership and initiate, support, endorsement of our CARE model. And implement it on a conference basis. We know, folks are kind of waiting to see what kind of changes Division I will make, but there's opportunities obviously to direct what that looks like. And we're hopeful that this has been helpful to you all to hear, how it could be implemented. So I wanted to offer that. And then again, we'll all be available if you have specific questions. But again, we want to thank you for everything you're doing. We know it's been a difficult and challenging couple of years with managing COVID, and now at the same time, looking to transform Division I. So we just thank you for, all that you are investing personally, professionally, and all the leadership that all of you have shown throughout your careers, but also particularly these past couple of years have been particularly challenging. So thank you again for being here today, and we'll be around if you have any questions. So thank you.
Nice to meet you. Yeah, unfortunately, I don't.